Hello. It's been a pretty eventful year so far, and I think one of the defining events is going to be these protests in Russia. So I've meant to speak about this one for a while now, but I've just been busy. But they show no signs of abating, and that's it's good and bad. It's bad first of all because it means that there's going to be a lot more police brutality, arbitrary arrests. Due process in Russia is really not something that can be relied on. So it's bad from that point of view, from the human rights abuses that are obviously going to take place with this. However, it's also good because it shows that more and more people are being galvanized, I think, against the Putin regime. Um, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Alexei Navalny must be one of the bravest people in the world. This is a man who's been in jail 10 times, I understand. Um, he's been assaulted numerous times. He has had clear attempts on his life at least twice now, but he just keeps going. Um, it's true that he has a slightly shady past insofar as he was accused of being alongside some pretty nationalistic figures. But, Russia is a very complex country. And it's a fascinating country, but it's a country that I think I think you need to look at the context of a country that is as big as it is. So, in order to get any sort of change, would require a certain degree of maneuvering that might not be necessarily the norm in a smaller country. Um, but the latest round of protests, I'm just going to read from the BBC article here. Bear with me a second, because they've summed it up better than I can. Um, this is from today. Putin critic Navalny jailed in Russia. A Moscow court has jailed Putin critic Alexei Navalny for 3.5 years for violating the conditions of his suspended sentence. He has been in detention since returning to Russia last month. He had been treated in Germany for a near fatal nerve agent attack against him in August. That's, of course, that famous video that showed Navalny groaning in agony on flight from, I believe it was from Tomsk to Moscow, and it had to make an emergency landing in Omsk, the Siberian city of Omsk. His suspended sentence for embezzlement has been converted into a jail term. He has already served a year under house arrest, which will be deducted from the total. Mr. Navalny greeted the news with a resigned shrug, the BBC's Sarah Rainsford in Moscow reports. In court, he called President Vladimir Putin a poisoner, blaming him for the attack. His supporters called for an immediate protest. His supporters called for an immediate protest and tried to gather outside court, but the whole area was overrun with riot police. More than 300 have been detained, according to monitors. Now, strength of feeling among his supporters is such that people were actually pelting the police with snowballs in, conditions that were met well under freezing in the city of Irkutsk. It's important to understand that these protests are not just restricted to Moscow, in which case they might be easy to dismiss as just a kind of clique of Navalny supporters. Um, it's true that Putin still has a lot of support in Russia, and I think it would be naive to think that what we're seeing is a revolution. I don't think it is, at least not yet. But I, I'm cautiously optimistic that this might just be the beginning of the end of the Putin regime. The reason I say that is these are the largest protests for some time in Russia, I'd say since 2011. Um, and I think people are galvanized. I think the authorities are acting more robustly this time than usual, which indicates to me that they're scared. I think Putin is scared, in part because of these viral videos that Navalny has produced showing the endemic corruption at the heart of this regime. I mean, wealth is doesn't sum it up. It's almost like Putin and his inner circle are like Bond villains. It's not just Putin; it's also Dmitry Medvedev and others. Um, the sort of opulence, these saunas, these mansions in the forests, they just they've been used apparently with drone technology. But what I find interesting about that is they really are viral. I think the top video has 85 million views. Now that far exceeds anything that RT can come out with. And for me, that's good news because I've made no secret of the fact that I hate RT. I think it is a disgrace to journalism. It's nothing but a mouthpiece for an authoritarian, totalitarian regime. Um, it's probably too early to start writing Putin's political obituary, but I'm just going to sum up his record as I see it. When Putin came to power in 2000, New Year's Day 2000, in fact, Yeltsin resigned, obviously, to get attention, partly on the last day of the millennium. But when Putin came to power, it's understandable why he was popular. Yeltsin was associated with corruption and rampant crime. True that Russia had opened up more, and I think in the West it's important for us to know this and maybe understand why Putin got the support he did. Because whilst Boris Yeltsin, in many ways, is a very interesting character as well, because he's associated with being the great sort of Democrat president in Russia, and yet his era is also seen as an era of stagnation, kind of like a 90s version of the Brezhnev era of stagnation, but also associated with rampant crime that wasn't as bad in the Soviet Union. I mean, it wasn't. Also, the brutal First Chechen War. So Putin came in, he was seen as stable. He was a lot more stable personally. He wasn't a heavy drinker. He didn't embarrass the country as Yeltsin often did. So that's understandable. Putin also cultivated a strongman image, and he got over early scandals such as the Kursk tragedy and his handling of that. Um, and he fostered a personality cult, much like the old Soviet leaders. Um, but Putin very much made it the case that Russia was going to make its presence on the world, whereas the Yeltsin era had been one of sort of, embarrassment in some ways. Putin was saying, "We're a great nation, and I'm going to put Russia back on the map." Now, that's understandable from a national leader's perspective. But then, when you start looking at his actual foreign policy record, it's pretty appalling, in my opinion. Of course, the supporters would say it's assertive, but it's absolutely tyrannical when you start to break it down. This is a leader who has fostered an industrial scale misinformation campaign via state mouthpieces like RT. I find it pretty ironic that they're now lecturing the American State Department that these are Russia's domestic affairs when Russia has been interfering in the West for years via RT. Make no mistake about it, RT is not just another news network. I consider it part of the Russian government. I really do. It was founded by Russian ultranationalists. And you'll notice that whenever they cover stories in the West, it's always very polarizing, taboo issues. Now, it's not that they shouldn't report those things, but they are doing that in such a way as to stoke up divisions in the West. They never, ever report anything positive. So there's very clearly an agenda going on there, and they bristle when they're called propaganda because they know that they are. Um, they have that stupid tagline, "Question more." Oh, but you don't never question Putin, do you? It's Their hypocrisy is infuriating. But anyway, I could talk all day about RT. Putin's support of the Assad regime, prolonged suffering of the Syrian people, Russian bombing raids definitely cost civilian casualties. Okay, American bombing raids have also cost civilian casualties elsewhere, but it just goes to show that Russia can't take a moral high ground on that. I remember when Putin was pointing fingers at the West over supposedly supporting ISIS. There's no hard evidence that that is actually the case. But of course, Putin distorted that. Um, but the point is, by supporting a murderous regime, Russia has absolutely prolonged the suffering of the Syrian people. Um, as for Ukraine, I mean, that's absolutely to use bullying in international politics. That is a clear example of a major power bullying a smaller country. Um, I mean, you might argue there is a historic argument that Ukraine was part of Russian territory, but Russia didn't exactly win the PR campaign with that, with some of the way they went about that, with the downing of MH17, with the lack of transparency that Russia has frequently shown. There's so many other things. And from a British perspective, what happened in Salisbury was sickening. It was sickening that RT dismissed it as callously as it did, even basically mocking what had happened. Let's not forget two British civilians died. As far as I'm concerned, that was an act of state terrorism. Um, and it's not the first time that Russia has engaged in this sort of state terrorism. I mean, the idea that Alexei Navalny poisoned himself is absurd. But what's troubling is the level of state media is such that there are a lot of Russians believe that. It's true that there's an increasing number of Russians turning against Putin, but this is not, I'm not so naive as to think there's a revolution happening. But I do think it's right that free nations vocally support Navalny and vocally condemn what is happening. Um, because Putin and his thugs need to know that there can't be a situation where they just do as they please. Um, if they have any actual crimes against Navalny, they need to produce the evidence, but they need to understand what the optics of this are. This is a man who is a critic of the regime, who has exposed corruption, and to the free world, he is being punished for that. I mean, the Russian state is very arrogant, but I don't believe it's stupid. So I don't know how they think that people are going to believe that Navalny poisoned himself. I mean, look at it from a practical point of view. If his agenda was to poison himself to make the Kremlin look bad and, just continue his kind of campaign, um, well, it's a very big risk because he could have died had he not got the medical treatment in Berlin. Their absurd and cruel rationale for him absconding is because he was getting treatment. I mean, this defies comprehension, even though the Kremlin has allowed him to leave before for treatment. So it's absurd when you really break it down. Um, Rather than putting Navalny on trial, they should be explaining those videos. They should be explaining why the president and the prime minister on their average salaries. If you actually look at the stated salaries from the Duma of the Russian president and the prime minister, certainly it's not the sort of salaries that can afford the multi-billion dollar ruble complexes that have been shown in those videos. So if they've nothing to hide, then they could easily dismiss that. They could say the videos are embellished or fake or whatever, and they'd be able to prove that. But of course they can't, because when you scratch away, you're left with one conclusion that Navalny is a thorn in the side, and they're trying to silence the man. Now, at this point, he's too famous and too high profile for them to simply, you know, to put it bluntly, to kill the man like with a bullet. So they're giving him the show trial. They're going to put him in jail. They have put him in jail, but I think the Kremlin's actually got itself into a bit of a trap with this, and that's why I'm somewhat optimistic because if they kill him, they martyrize him, and they know that. Because Alexei Navalny is a lot more high profile than other critics like uh, Anna Politkovskaya and others. Um, he's quite wealthy. He's a very good organizer. He's quite young, so he's still got a lot of time. He's only in his 40s. So, this is not a stupid man. I have enormous respect for Alexei Navalny. I'm sure he has his shortcomings, like every human being does, but it is hard not to respect a man who takes the personal risks that he does. And, they've targeted his family as well. This is a regime that locked up his brother, excuse me, to try and get at him. Um, the acid attack was disgusting. This is not to say that everyone who dies in Russia is at the hands of Putin. Boris Nemtsov was more like the Chechen gangsters, but the excuses that the Kremlin comes out with, I mean, Sergei Lavrov claiming that there's no evidence that Navalny was poisoned or that he'd done it to himself, it's just absurd. But I think what's different about this situation is that because Navalny's high profile, the Kremlin's kind of in a difficult position because if they jail him, then he can continue galvanizing support. Um, if they kill him, he becomes a martyr. And the more hardline they get with these protests, the more hated the regime is going to be. And it might well turn moderate Russians against it. By moderate, I don't mean moderate in the Western sense necessarily. I mean moderate insofar as they don't necessarily support Putin or Navalny. Um, I'm under no illusions. Navalny is not, and outsiders need to be careful not to see Navalny as kind of the great democratic leader that millions of Russians want. I don't think it's that. Although I should respect personally for him, I don't think that's probably the situation on the ground from what I've seen. Um, I do think Putin's popularity is waning. I think there is some evidence of that. COVID hasn't helped. The Russian state has in all likelihood covered up the true death toll. There's been mysterious deaths of doctors. Um, it hasn't helped. So, Brezhnev was in power for what was it, 18 years? Putin now 20 years. Um, if if we include that period where he was prime minister, where it was really a tandem situation, even purely as president, 16 years, it's a long time. So, and of course, he's just extended his term limits. So, at some point, every dictatorship comes to an end. I'm not saying I think there's going to be a revolution in Russia, but it might be that this is more like a gradual thing. And it might be that there is something eventually forces Putin from power. Now, his apologists will say if Putin leaves power, then Russia will descend into chaos, and that will not be good for the world. Maybe not, but clearly Putin's been in power for far too long. There's no way that Russia can rationally be called a democracy when during federal elections Putin and his party get the vast majority of airtime. And I'm well aware that there are some unsavory characters that might be even worse than Putin, the likes of Vladimir Zhirinovsky and all our ultra nationalists. But um, as far as I'm concerned, Vladimir Putin is a threat to the world's stability, certainly to security in Central and Eastern Europe, and as we've seen, to Britain as well. And his apologists need to answer this. What is the likelihood that five American administrations and five British administrations are all wrong and Putin's right? Because that is kind of the narrative that they try to spin. Um, I think we need to see the Putin regime for what it is, a bunch of corrupt thugs and a regime that rules by fear, a regime that rules by thuggery. Um, Putin, by his own admission, was a hooligan as a youth. Um, but, it'll be an interesting thing to see what develops. But the courage of Alexei Navalny, whatever else you think, even if you don't support him politically, you can't deny his personal courage in standing up to Putin. And whether he's putting on a brave front or whether he genuinely is just expects it at this point, I can't help but admire Alexei Navalny, whatever shortcomings he might have, because anyone who stands up to Putin, they know it's a risk. And this man has done it time and time again, despite threats to his life. Hard not to respect that. Um, I really do hope it's the beginning of the end because Putin's a threat to my country. Um, and I would like to see the Russian ruling regime knocked off its perch, quite frankly. And as for interference, I think if the US State Department is sensible, they will not, they will make statements like, we urge Americans not to get involved and we are observing, but make condemnation. Because that way, the Kremlin can't say you're interfering when all they're doing is making statements, when they don't actually have any hard evidence that the State Department is interfering. Now, the power that the CIA has, further down the road, it might be that it's some sort of covert operation. But, a country as big as Russia, the second or third most powerful country in the world, that's even the CIA couldn't just pull that one off. So this will definitely be an interesting situation to watch. But my thoughts are very much with Alexei Navalny and the thousands of Russians who've been arbitrarily detained simply for demanding more freedom, demanding basic human rights. I'm on their side.